The room was dimly lit, its silence pierced only by the occasional shuffling of papers from the guards stationed nearby. John Carter, a wiry man in his late 30s, sat with his hands clasped, his rough skin and calloused fingers betraying years of hard labor. His deep blue eyes, framed by lines of fatigue and grief, were fixed on the floor. Despite his rugged appearance, there was a quiet dignity about him that contrasted sharply with the orange jumpsuit he wore. The warden, a stern-faced man with salt and pepper hair, cleared his throat as he leaned forward in his chair. "Carter," he began, his tone steady but not without a hint of pity, "you've been granted one final request. I need to know what it is." John hesitated, his throat tightening. He had spent sleepless nights pondering this very question. His life, marred by injustice, was set to end in a matter of days. Yet, as his mind roamed through memories of the one constant source of light in his life, the answer became clear. "I want to see Blaze," he said finally, his voice firm. "My horse." The warden's eyebrows furrowed. "Your horse?" he repeated, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Yes," John replied, his voice unwavering. He's more than just a horse to me. He's family." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room. The guards exchanged puzzled glances, but the warden remained stoic. "I'll see what I can do," he said after a pause, though his tone carried doubt. "It's an unusual request, but we'll review it." As John was escorted back to his cell, the weight of his reality pressed down on him. Each step felt heavier, each breath more labored. Blaze had been his companion through years of hardship, his silent confidant in a world that had often turned its back on him. The thought of seeing the horse one last time filled him with a bittersweet mix of hope and sorrow. In the small, bustling town of Elmswood, Blaze was a familiar sight. The fiery chestnut stallion with a white blaze running down his forehead was known for his intelligence and gentle demeanor. At the Dawson Ranch, Blaze was not merely a workhorse but a beloved member of the family. Margaret Dawson, a woman in her late 40s with soft gray streaks in her auburn hair, had often remarked on how Blaze seemed to have a sixth sense about people. "Blaze has a heart bigger than Texas," she would say with a smile, brushing his mane under the sprawling oaks of the ranch. He's always been John's shadow. Wherever John went, Blaze wasn't far behind. Margaret's husband, William, was more reserved but equally fond of the horse. A burly man with weathered features, he valued loyalty above all else, and Blaze had proven time and again to be loyal to a fault. When news of John's incarceration had reached the Dawson household, it had sent shockwaves through the family. Emily, their 10-year-old daughter, had been particularly distraught. "John would never hurt anyone," she insisted tearfully, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. "He's like an uncle to me." Her parents exchanged worried glances, but remained silent. The evidence against John had been damning, and in their tightly knit community, accusations carried heavy weight. Days later, the warden called John into the office. "Your request has been approved," he said curtly. "Blaze will be brought to the yard on the morning of your execution." John's breath hitched. Relief flooded through him, mingled with an ache in his chest. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. As he returned to his cell, John sat on the cot, lost in thought. The memory of Blaze galloping across the open fields of the Dawson Ranch played in his mind like a movie. He whispered to himself, "Blaze, you're my last connection to freedom, to everything good I've ever known." Outside the prison, arrangements were underway to transport Blaze to the facility. The news of John's unusual request began to circulate, sparking curiosity and debate among locals. Some saw it as a touching gesture, others as a futile distraction from the grim reality awaiting him. Unbeknownst to all, Blaze's arrival would set in motion a chain of events that would unravel the truth behind Emily's disappearance and change the course of John's fate forever. Nestled in the rolling plains of Elmswood, the Dawson Ranch was a sprawling expanse of golden pastures dotted with towering oak trees. The two-story farmhouse, with its weathered wooden panels and wraparound porch, stood as a testament to decades of hard work. Beyond it, a large red barn, the heart of the operation, housed the tools, feed, and animals that made the ranch thrive. John Carter had arrived at the Dawson Ranch 5 years earlier, seeking work after drifting from job to job across Texas. At first glance, he seemed like any other farmhand. Rugged, with a lean frame and hands that spoke of laborious years. But there was a quiet resilience about him that caught William Dawson's attention during their first meeting. "You've got experience working with horses?" William asked, scrutinizing John from under his cowboy hat. "Yes, sir," John replied, his voice steady. "I grew up around them. I know how to handle a plow team, fix tack, and keep them healthy." William gave a curt nod. "We'll see if you're as good as you say. Work starts at dawn." John quickly proved his worth, not just with his skill but with his unwavering dedication. Blaze, the Dawsons' prize stallion, took an immediate liking to him. It was rare for the horse to warm up to strangers, but with John, the bond was almost instant. The two were inseparable, and it wasn't long before Blaze became more of a companion than just a workhorse. "Blaze trusts you," Margaret observed one afternoon as she watched John brush the stallion's coat. Her voice carried a mix of curiosity and approval. "That horse has always been picky about who gets near him." John chuckled softly, pausing to pat Blaze's neck. "He's got a good sense about people. Animals usually do." Margaret studied John for a moment before speaking again. "You're good with him, John. And with Emily, too. She adores you." The mention of Emily brought a soft smile to John's face. The little girl often trailed him around the ranch, peppering him with endless questions about the horses and ranch work. John didn't mind. Her bright laughter and boundless curiosity reminded him of simpler, happier times. "Uncle John, why does Blaze's nose look like a lightning bolt?" she had asked one day, pointing to the white streak on the stallion's face. "Because he's fast as lightning," John replied with a grin, lifting her onto Blaze's back. "Want to see?" Emily's squeal of delight as Blaze trotted gently around the paddock was a memory John cherished deeply. It was moments like these that made him feel a part of the family, even though he was just the hired help. The Dawsons' trust in John grew over the years. William, a man of few words, would occasionally pat John on the back after a long day's work and say, "Good job today." For William, that was high praise. Margaret, more expressive, would often insist he join them for supper, despite John's protests. "Don't be silly," she'd say, waving him into the dining room. "You've earned a hot meal." Even Emily had taken to setting a place for Uncle John at the table without asking. It was these small acts of kindness that made the ranch feel like home to John, a feeling he hadn't known in years. But as idyllic as life seemed on the surface, tension simmered beneath. The neighboring rancher, Robert Grayson, had long harbored resentment toward the Dawsons, blaming them for his declining business. John had crossed paths with Grayson a few times, and each encounter left a sour taste in his mouth. "You're wasting your time with the Dawsons," Grayson had sneered once, his eyes cold and calculating. "They're not as righteous as they seem." John had walked away without responding, but the man's words lingered like a dark cloud. Looking back now, sitting in his prison cell, John replayed those days in his mind with a mixture of longing and heartbreak. The ranch had been his sanctuary, Blaze his steadfast companion, and the Dawsons the closest thing to family he had. But all of it had been shattered the day Emily disappeared. He could still see the panic on Margaret's face as she screamed Emily's name, her voice cracking with fear. He remembered the search parties combing the fields, the bloodhound sniffing the ground for any trace of the little girl. And he remembered the moment everything turned against him, the discovery of Emily's dress in his barn. "They trusted me," John whispered to himself, his voice heavy with anguish. How did it all go so wrong? Blaze's image flashed in his mind, the horse standing alone in the field as John was taken away in handcuffs. He clenched his fists, vowing silently, "I'll clear my name. For Blaze. For Emily. For myself." The afternoon sun bathed the Dawson Ranch in a golden glow as Emily skipped across the yard, her laughter echoing in the open air. She clutched her favorite stuffed bear, a small brown creature with a tattered ear and a blue ribbon around its neck. "Uncle John," she called, spotting him near the barn. "Can Blaze and I go for a ride?" John looked up from his work, brushing dust off his jeans. "Not today, kiddo," he said with a smile, his voice gentle but firm. Blaze has been working hard this morning. He needs a break. Emily pouted, but her bright hazel eyes twinkled mischievously. Fine. Then I'll just explore the creek, she declared, pointing toward the woods at the edge of the property. John hesitated, glancing toward the trees. Stay close to the house, Emily, and be back before dinner. Promise? Promise, she chirped, darting off before he could say more. Dinner came and went, but Emily didn't return. Margaret's worry began as a subtle crease in her brow, but quickly grew into full-blown panic. She said she'd be back, Margaret murmured, pacing the kitchen. Her hands trembled as she clutched the dish rag, wringing it anxiously. Maybe she got distracted, William said, though his tone betrayed his own unease. He grabbed his hat and called out to John, who was tending to Blaze. Emily hasn't come back. Let's go find her. The search began near the creek, where Emily often played. The fading daylight cast long shadows, making every rustling bush and snapping twig feel ominous. John called her name, his voice steady but growing more desperate with each passing minute. Emily, it's Uncle John. Come on out, kiddo. But the woods remained silent. By nightfall, the entire town had been alerted. Neighbors gathered at the Dawson Ranch, forming search parties to comb the surrounding area. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness, and the barking of bloodhounds filled the night air. Margaret stood on the porch, her face pale and tear-streaked, clutching the railing for support. John returned to the house, his boots caked with mud and his face etched with worry. We'll find her, Mrs. Dawson, he said, his voice resolute. She's a smart girl. She wouldn't wander far. Margaret nodded weakly, but her eyes were filled with fear. She's just a child, she whispered. What if someone took her? The thought hung heavily in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. The next morning, a grim discovery brought the search to a halt. Near the entrance to the barn, one of the searchers found Emily's dress, muddy and torn, with small, dark stains that looked alarmingly like blood. Beside it lay her beloved teddy bear, its blue ribbon frayed. Margaret let out a piercing scream, collapsing into William's arms. No, this can't be happening, she cried. John stood frozen, his heart sinking. He moved to pick up the dress, but a deputy stopped him, his expression hard. Don't touch anything, the man ordered. This is a crime scene now. Within hours, the barn was swarmed by law enforcement. They scoured every corner, and it wasn't long before they uncovered more damning evidence. A blood-stained knife and a small, muddy footprint that seemed to match Emily's. The sheriff, a gruff man with a thick mustache, confronted John in the barn. Carter, he said, his voice stern. What do you know about this? Nothing, John replied, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. I would never hurt Emily. You know that. The sheriff squinted at him, his eyes cold and calculating. You were the last one to see her, and all this was found in your barn. Doesn't look good, son. John's protests fell on deaf ears. The community, once supportive, now turned against him. Whispers of betrayal and anger spread like wildfire. By the time John was led away in handcuffs, the crowd outside the ranch was yelling for justice. Uncle John didn't do it. Emily's best friend, a boy named Tommy, shouted from the crowd. But his small voice was drowned out by the sea of accusations. Back at the ranch, Blaze stood by the barn, his dark eyes watching as John was driven away in the sheriff's car. The stallion let out a low, mournful neigh, pawing at the ground as if sensing the injustice unfolding. Margaret sat on the porch, clutching Emily's teddy bear to her chest. William stood beside her, his face a mask of grief and fury. I trusted him, he said bitterly, his voice shaking. How could he do this? Margaret shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, but if he did, if he hurt our Emily, she couldn't finish the thought, her voice breaking into sobs. The once peaceful Dawson Ranch was now a place of heartbreak and suspicion, and as Blaze wandered the property, restless and agitated, the truth about Emily's disappearance remained shrouded in darkness. The investigation into Emily's disappearance had shifted into high gear. The sheriff's office became a hub of activity, with deputies combing through every corner of the Dawson Ranch and the surrounding areas. Tensions in the town reached a boiling point. People who once spoke of John Carter as a hard-working and reliable man now whispered about him with suspicion and disdain. At the center of the storm, John sat in a dimly lit interrogation room at the county jail. His hands were cuffed, and his face bore the weight of exhaustion and despair. Across the table, Sheriff Tom Ward, a grizzled man in his early 50s, leaned forward with a skeptical glare. "You're not making this easy on yourself, Carter," Ward said, his voice steady but edged with impatience. "We found Emily's dress and bear in your barn. Blood on the knife matches her type. You've got to start talking." John met the sheriff's gaze with unwavering defiance. "I've got nothing to confess because I didn't do it," he said, his voice low but firm. "I loved that little girl like she was my own family. Someone's setting me up?" Ward sighed heavily, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You expect me to believe that? You're the only one who had access to that barn." "Plenty of people had access," John snapped. "Anyone could have planted that stuff there." Ward didn't respond immediately. He simply leaned back in his chair, studying John. "If you're innocent, Carter, you'd better hope something clears your name. Because right now, you're the only one with a motive and opportunity." Back at the ranch, Margaret Dawson stood at the edge of the barn, staring at the wooden structure as if it were a stranger. She held Emily's torn dress in her hands, which the deputies had returned to her after collecting evidence. The fabric felt alien, like a piece of someone else's nightmare. William approached her, his face grim. "You shouldn't hold on to that, Margaret," he said softly. "It'll only make things harder." "How can I let go?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "This dress is all I have left of her." William placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "We'll find her," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No matter what it takes." In the days that followed, the community grew restless. The evidence against John seemed overwhelming, but whispers of doubt began to creep in. People who had known John for years struggled to reconcile the idea of him committing such a heinous act. Blaze, meanwhile, had become a focal point of attention at the ranch. The horse's agitation was evident to anyone who approached. He paced the paddock, let out restless whinnies, and repeatedly returned to the barn as if searching for something or someone. Tommy, Emily's best friend, had been visiting the ranch almost daily, driven by a child's determination to help find his missing friend. One afternoon, he stood by the paddock fence, watching Blaze with a furrowed brow. "Something's bothering him," Tommy said aloud, though no one was around to hear. He climbed the fence and approached the stallion cautiously. Blaze snorted, but allowed the boy to stroke his mane. "What is it, boy?" Tommy murmured. "You know something, don't you?" Blaze let out a sharp whinny and turned his head toward the barn. Tommy followed the horse's gaze, his heart racing. It was as if Blaze was trying to communicate. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Tommy approached Margaret and William with a mix of excitement and trepidation. "I think Blaze is trying to tell us something," he blurted out. William raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about, son?" "Every time I go near him, he keeps looking at the barn," Tommy explained. "It's like he knows something's there." Margaret exchanged a skeptical glance with William. "He's a horse, Tommy," she said gently. "He's probably just restless without John." "No," Tommy insisted, his voice firm. "It's more than that. Please, Mr. Dawson, can't we check again?" William sighed, but something in Tommy's earnestness struck a chord. "All right, kid," he said. "We'll take another look." The barn was eerily quiet as William, Margaret, and Tommy stepped inside. Armed with flashlights, they combed through the stalls and storage areas. Blaze stood outside, his ears perked and his eyes fixed on the doorway. "Nothing here," William muttered after a while, but Tommy wasn't ready to give up. He noticed a loose floorboard near one of the back stalls and knelt down to inspect it. "What's this?" he said, prying at the wood. With some effort, he lifted the board to reveal a small, hidden compartment. Inside were a few items: a child's button, a piece of fabric, and a small toy car. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Those are Emily's," she whispered, her voice shaking. William's face darkened. "How did these get here?" Tommy looked up at them, his young face pale but determined. "I told you," he said. Blaze knew. The discovery reignited the investigation. Sheriff Ward was called to the ranch, and the new evidence shifted focus away from John. If these were hidden here, Ward said, examining the items, then someone had to know this barn inside out. Someone who wanted to frame Carter. Blaze's restlessness now made sense to Margaret. The horse had been trying to lead them to the truth. As she stroked his mane that evening, she whispered, "Good boy, Blaze. You're smarter than we ever gave you credit for." But the question still loomed. Who had hidden the items, and where was Emily? The ranch was quiet, the kind of stillness that pressed down on everything like a heavy blanket. Blaze stood in his paddock, the golden rays of the setting sun glinting off his chestnut coat. Margaret watched him from the porch, her mind swirling with thoughts. The horse had always been special, but now it seemed he was more than that. He was a beacon in their darkest hour. Meanwhile, William paced the kitchen, frustration etched into his weathered face. "We've got new evidence, but it doesn't get us any closer to finding Emily," he muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. "If John didn't do this, who did?" Margaret's voice was steady but laced with sadness. "Blaze knows something. He's been trying to tell us all along." William shook his head, his skepticism battling with a flicker of hope. "He's a horse, Margaret. A smart one. Sure, but he led us to the compartment," she interrupted, her tone firm. "He knows." That evening, Margaret decided to test her theory. She slipped on her boots and walked out to Blaze's paddock, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. "Hey there, boy," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You've been trying to tell us something, haven't you?" Blaze turned his head toward her, his dark eyes seeming to hold an understanding that went beyond his animal nature. Margaret unlatched the gate and let him out. "Show me," she whispered, hoping against hope that he could guide her. Blaze moved with purpose, his hooves crunching softly on the gravel as he headed toward the barn. Margaret followed, her heart pounding. Once inside, Blaze stopped near the same loose floorboard that had revealed the hidden items. He snorted and pawed at the ground, as if urging her to look closer. Margaret crouched down, her hands trembling as she felt around the area. There was nothing new beneath the board, but Blaze wasn't finished. He nudged her gently with his nose, then turned and began pacing toward the edge of the barn, where the floor met the wall. "What is it, boy?" Margaret murmured, following him. She knelt down again and noticed a faint trail of dirt leading to a gap between the boards. With a surge of determination, she called for William. William arrived moments later, a flashlight in hand. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with exasperation. "Blaze is onto something," Margaret said. "Help me move this panel." Together, they pried the wooden panel loose, revealing a small, concealed space behind the barn wall. Inside was a bundle of rope, a dirty cloth, and a note scrawled hastily on torn paper. William's hands shook as he unfolded the note. The message was chilling in its simplicity. "She's safe for now, but don't push me," Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Who would do this?" she stammered. William's jaw tightened. "Someone who knows this property well enough to use our barn," he said grimly. "This isn't just about Emily. It's about us." The discovery reignited the investigation, but it also put the Dawsons on edge. Sheriff Ward took the new evidence seriously, but progress was slow. Meanwhile, Blaze's behavior grew more insistent. He began pacing near the fence line that bordered the Grayson property, his ears swiveling and nostrils flaring whenever someone approached. Tommy, who had been a near-constant presence at the ranch since Emily's disappearance, noticed Blaze's agitation. "I think he's trying to tell us something again," he said one afternoon, his small voice filled with conviction. William knelt beside the boy, his expression softening. "What do you think he's saying, Tommy?" Tommy pointed toward the Grayson property. "I think he wants us to look over there." That night, as the family sat around the table, Margaret voiced what they were all thinking. "It's Grayson," she said quietly. "He's been after us for years, trying to sabotage the ranch. What if he's behind this?" William nodded reluctantly. "It's possible, but we can't just accuse him without proof." Margaret's gaze hardened. "Then we find proof." The next morning, William and Margaret took Blaze to the fence line. The stallion's behavior became even more animated, pawing at the ground and letting out sharp, urgent whinnies. It was as if he could sense something just beyond their reach. "We'll call the sheriff," William said, his voice steady. But this time, Blaze is leading the way. Blaze's instincts proved invaluable. When the sheriff and his deputies arrived, the horse guided them to a storage area on the Grayson property. What they found there would change everything. A hidden underground space, carefully concealed beneath a pile of old crates. Inside, they found Emily. The discovery of Emily alive, though frail and frightened, sent a wave of relief and shock through everyone involved. She was rushed to the hospital, her parents clinging to her as though letting go might cause her to vanish again. Sheriff Ward, now fully immersed in the investigation, wasted no time interrogating Robert Grayson. The underground space on Grayson's property had been disturbingly well hidden. It was a small, dimly lit room with just enough space for a child to move around. A few blankets, a water bottle, and a stash of candy bars indicated that Emily had been kept alive, but in distressing conditions. At the hospital, Margaret sat by Emily's bedside, stroking her daughter's hair while William paced near the window. Emily's voice was faint as she recounted what had happened. "He told me I had to stay quiet," she whispered, her hazel eyes wide with fear. "He said if I screamed, he'd hurt Blaze." Margaret's heart ached at the mention of the horse, her tears spilling over. "Blaze would never let anyone hurt you," she said softly. "He helped us find you." Meanwhile, back at the sheriff's office, Grayson remained defiant. Seated across from Ward in the stark interrogation room, he sneered at the accusations. "You've got no proof I had anything to do with this," he said, leaning back in his chair with an air of smug confidence. Ward slammed a hand on the table, his patience wearing thin. "We found the girl on your property, Grayson. We've got her testimony and the evidence to back it up." Grayson chuckled darkly. "You think that's enough? I'll have my lawyer rip that to shreds. Besides, you should be looking at Carter, not me. He's the real criminal." Ward leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Carter might have been a suspect, but Blaze, his horse, led us straight to Emily. And if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that animals don't lie." Grayson's smirk faltered for just a moment, a crack in his otherwise confident facade. Ward caught it and pressed further. "You've been trying to sabotage the Dawsons for years. This was your way of getting to them, wasn't it?" While the interrogation continued, Blaze had become somewhat of a local hero. News of the stallion's role in Emily's rescue spread quickly, drawing curious townsfolk to the Dawson ranch. Margaret, despite her exhaustion, welcomed visitors with gratitude. "Blaze saved my daughter's life," she told them, her voice breaking with emotion. "We owe him everything." Tommy, who had been instrumental in following Blaze's cues, beamed with pride. "I told you he knew something," he said to anyone who would listen. A breakthrough in the investigation came when deputies discovered additional evidence in Grayson's home. A torn piece of fabric matching Emily's dress and a journal with detailed notes about the Dawson schedules. It was clear that Grayson had meticulously planned the abduction, hoping to frame John and destroy the Dawson family in one fell swoop. When confronted with the evidence, Grayson's composure crumbled. "Fine," he spat, slamming his fist on the table. "I did it, but they had it coming. Always lording their success over me, acting like they're better than everyone else." Ward's expression was cold. "You endangered a child and ruined an innocent man's life," he said. "Whatever grudge you had doesn't excuse what you've done." With Grayson in custody and Emily safe, the focus shifted to clearing John Carter's name. Sheriff Ward personally visited John in his cell, the weight of guilt evident on his face. "You were right," Ward admitted. "You didn't do it. We found Emily, and we've got the real culprit." John's shoulders sagged with relief, but his eyes remained sharp. "And Blaze? Is he all right?" Ward nodded. "He's fine. In fact, he's the reason we found her. That horse of yours is something special." John's release was met with a mix of relief and celebration. When he stepped out of the jailhouse, Blaze was waiting for him, tethered to a post with Margaret and William standing beside him. The moment John saw the horse, his tough exterior cracked. "Blaze," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The stallion whinnied softly, nudging John's shoulder as if to say, "I knew you'd be back." Margaret stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "John," she began, her voice trembling, "we're so sorry. We should have believed you." John shook his head. "It's not your fault," he said quietly. "What matters is Emily's safe." William extended his hand, his grip firm and sincere. "We owe you and Blaze more than we can ever repay." "Thank you." The townsfolk soon rallied around John, offering their apologies and support. Blaze became a symbol of loyalty and courage, his story inspiring countless people across Elmswood and beyond. But for John, the most important part was standing beside Blaze, knowing they had both survived the storm together. Despite the relief of Emily's safe return and the confession from Robert Grayson, questions lingered. Sheriff Ward, a methodical man who believed in tying up every loose end, wasn't entirely satisfied. The circumstances surrounding the planted evidence in John's barn and the deliberate framing of an innocent man warranted further scrutiny. Back at the sheriff's office, Ward and his deputies pored over the case files. "Grayson's confession is solid," Deputy Harris remarked, "but the way this all played out feels too orchestrated." Ward nodded, his sharp eyes scanning the photos of the barn and the hidden compartment. "Exactly. Grayson's smart, but he doesn't strike me as meticulous enough to pull off something this calculated. Someone else might have helped him." Meanwhile, on the Dawson Ranch, life began to settle back into a fragile sense of normalcy. Emily, still recovering from her ordeal, spent most of her days resting indoors. Blaze, as always, remained close, his presence a comfort not just to Emily but to the entire family. One afternoon, Tommy visited the ranch, his curiosity undiminished. "Mrs. Dawson," he asked as he sat on the porch steps, "do you think Grayson was working alone?" Margaret, who had been mending a fence, paused and looked at the boy. "What do you mean, Tommy?" Tommy hesitated, his young face serious. "It's just the way Blaze acted. It's like he knew something was wrong the whole time. What if there's more to the story?" Margaret considered his words carefully. "You might be right," she admitted. "Blaze is smarter than most people give him credit for. He's been trying to protect us from the start." Ward's investigation into Grayson's connections soon uncovered something startling. Financial records showed a series of payments to a man named Earl Hensley, a drifter with a history of petty crime and connections to Grayson's circle. When deputies tracked Hensley down at a seedy motel on the outskirts of town, he was less than cooperative. "I don't know nothing about no kidnapping," Hensley drawled, leaning back in his chair. "You can't pin that on me." Ward smirked, leaning forward. "Funny thing about criminals like you, Hensley, you're always sloppy. We found your fingerprints on the rope used to tie up Emily. Care to explain that?" Hensley's bravado faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I didn't hurt the kid, all right? Grayson paid me to stash her in that hidey hole. Said it was part of some scheme to mess with the Dawsons." Ward's jaw tightened. "And you didn't think to question why a grown man wanted you to hide a little girl?" Hensley shrugged, avoiding Ward's piercing gaze. "Didn't seem like my business." Ward's voice turned icy. "It is now. You're going to tell me everything, or I'll make sure you take the fall for all of it." With Hensley's confession, the full extent of Grayson's plan came to light. Grayson had orchestrated the entire scheme, from planting the evidence in John's barn to paying Hensley to hide Emily. His goal was not just to ruin the Dawsons, but to eliminate John as a trusted ally. Grayson believed that by framing John, he could destabilize the family's operations and swoop in to buy their ranch at a fraction of its value. The revelation sent shockwaves through Elmswood. Grayson, once a prominent figure in the community, was now seen as a villain of the highest order. Hensley's involvement added another layer of complexity, cementing the case against both men. At the Dawson Ranch, Ward delivered the news in person. "It's over," he told Margaret and William. "We've got everything we need to put Grayson and his accomplice away for good." Margaret exhaled deeply, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you and Blaze." Ward glanced toward the paddock, where Blaze stood watching them. "That horse is something else," he said with a small smile. "He didn't just save Emily. He helped bring justice to this town. William nodded, his expression resolute. Blaze deserves more than we can ever give him. As the dust settled, John returned to the ranch to a hero's welcome. The Dawsons, now fully aware of his innocence, went out of their way to make amends. Emily, clutching her beloved teddy bear, ran to greet him. "I knew you didn't do it, Uncle John," she said, her voice muffled as she hugged him tightly. Blaze knew too. John knelt down, his eyes misty. "Thank you, kiddo. That means more to me than you'll ever know." Margaret stepped forward, her face etched with emotion. "John," she said softly, "we've wronged you in ways we can never fully make up for. But if you'll have us, we'd like you to stay here, permanently. This ranch is as much yours as it is ours." John looked at Blaze, who let out a soft snort, as if urging him to accept. "I'd like that," John said, his voice steady. "Blaze and I are home." With the truth finally revealed and justice served, the Dawson Ranch returned to being a place of peace and hope. Blaze, now regarded as the hero of Elmswood, continued to inspire everyone who heard his story. For John, Emily, and the Dawsons, their bond was stronger than ever, a testament to loyalty, love, and the enduring connection between humans and animals. The sheriff's office wasted no time organizing a full-scale operation to search the underground space on the Grayson property. Blaze had led them to the hidden door, his instincts proving sharper than any humans. Sheriff Ward, now convinced of the horse's uncanny ability, led the search personally. As deputies carefully descended into the hidden chamber, the air was thick with tension. The space was cramped and poorly lit, with the musty smell of damp earth filling their noses. At first, the deputies found nothing but empty crates and scattered tools. Then, deep in the back of the chamber, they heard a faint sound, a soft whimper. "Over here," one of the deputies called, his flashlight beam revealing a small figure curled up in a corner. Emily Dawson was alive. Margaret and William were at the hospital within minutes of receiving the news. Emily lay on the bed, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Her once vibrant energy had dimmed, replaced by exhaustion and trepidation. But when she saw her parents enter the room, her small frame trembled with relief. "Mommy, Daddy," she cried, reaching out for them. Margaret rushed to her daughter's side, tears streaming down her face as she cradled Emily in her arms. "Oh, my baby," she sobbed. "You're safe now. You're safe." William stood beside them, his usually stoic demeanor breaking as he placed a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. "We've got you, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No one's going to hurt you ever again." As Emily recovered, she began to share pieces of what had happened. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as she recounted the events to Sheriff Ward, her parents, and John, who had been allowed to visit her at the hospital. "A man. He grabbed me," she began, her fingers clutching the blanket tightly. "He said I had to stay quiet, or he'd hurt Blaze." John's chest tightened at the mention of his horse. "Emily," he said gently, "Blaze is fine. He's the one who helped us find you." Emily's eyes brightened slightly at this. "Blaze did?" she asked, a hint of the old sparkle returning. John nodded, a faint smile on his face. "That horse is smarter than all of us put together." The details Emily provided confirmed much of what the investigation had uncovered. Grayson had orchestrated the kidnapping, driven by a twisted desire to sabotage the Dawsons. His accomplice, Earl Hensley, had been the one to physically take Emily and hide her in the underground space. "They said I couldn't leave," Emily whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was so scared." Margaret wrapped her arms around her daughter. "You're safe now," she murmured. "We'll never let anything happen to you again." Back at the Dawson Ranch, Blaze had become the centerpiece of celebration and gratitude. The horse's sharp instincts and unwavering loyalty had not only saved Emily but had also exposed the truth behind the conspiracy. Neighbors and townsfolk flocked to the ranch to see the now famous stallion, bringing gifts and sharing words of admiration. One visitor, an older rancher named Henry Palmer, summed it up best. "That horse isn't just an animal," he said, tipping his hat. "He's a hero." John, standing near Blaze's paddock, looked on with pride. "You've always been a hero to me, boy," he said, stroking Blaze's mane. "Now everyone else knows it too." Emily's return marked a turning point for the Dawson family and John. The bonds that had been strained by suspicion and doubt were now stronger than ever. Margaret and William publicly apologized to John, acknowledging the pain he had endured. "We let fear cloud our judgment," Margaret said, her voice trembling with sincerity. "You've always been part of this family, John. We're so sorry for what we put you through." John looked at them, his face a mixture of relief and forgiveness. "You trusted me when it mattered most," he said. "That's all that counts." The Dawsons made sure to honor Blaze's role in the events. They organized a small ceremony at the ranch, inviting the community to celebrate the stallion's courage. Emily, still regaining her strength, insisted on being the one to present Blaze with a special medal crafted by a local blacksmith. "You're the best horse in the world," she said, her voice filled with love as she fastened the medal around Blaze's neck. The crowd erupted in applause, and Blaze let out a soft, almost humble neigh. As life slowly returned to normal, the Dawson Ranch stood as a testament to resilience, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. Blaze, now a symbol of hope and courage, continued to be a source of comfort and inspiration for everyone who visited. For John, the experience had changed him profoundly. As he watched Emily laughing with Blaze in the paddock one sunny afternoon, he realized that justice and redemption were not just about clearing his name. They were about rebuilding the trust and love that made life worth living. The morning of John's release was quiet, but charged with emotion. The sheriff's office, a place that had once felt like a prison of despair, now stood as a gateway to freedom. Sheriff Ward himself arrived early, dressed neatly in his uniform, a solemn expression on his face. He knew he had played a part in the injustice John had suffered, and while the truth had prevailed, the weight of his earlier misjudgment lingered. As the guards unlocked the cell, John stood, his tall frame seemingly heavier with the burden of weeks spent wrongfully incarcerated. His rugged face, marked by lines of exhaustion, softened slightly when Ward stepped forward. "You're free to go, Carter," Ward said, his voice steady but filled with an undertone of remorse. "The charges have been dropped. I owe you an apology." John looked at the sheriff for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes unreadable. "An apology won't give me back the time I've lost," he said finally, his voice calm but firm. "But I'll take it, and I'll take my freedom." Outside the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered, friends, neighbors, and even people who had once doubted John's innocence. Margaret, William, and Emily were at the forefront, with Blaze standing tall beside them, his chestnut coat gleaming in the morning sunlight. When John stepped outside, the sight of Blaze stopped him in his tracks. The horse let out a soft, welcoming neigh and trotted forward, nudging John's shoulder with his nose. John's tough exterior cracked as he reached out, running his hand along Blaze's neck. "You never gave up on me, did you?" John murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Blaze snorted softly as if to say, "I knew you'd come back." Emily ran forward, her small arms wrapping around John's waist. "Uncle John, you're home," she cried, her voice filled with joy. John knelt to hug her, his eyes misting over. "I told you I'd be back, kiddo," he said, holding her tightly. "Thanks for believing in me." Margaret and William approached cautiously, their faces a mix of relief and guilt. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice trembling. "John, we can't express how sorry we are. We should have believed you." William nodded, his usual stoicism replaced with sincerity. "We were wrong, John. You've always been loyal to this family. We'll spend the rest of our lives making it up to you." John looked at them both, his expression softening. "I'm not one to hold grudges," he said. "What matters is that Emily's safe, and the truth's out. That's enough for me." The ride back to the Dawson Ranch was one of quiet reflection. Blaze walked alongside John, his steady pace matching the slow unraveling of tension that had gripped the family for weeks. When they arrived, the familiar sights and sounds of the ranch welcomed John like an old friend. The sprawling fields, the red barn, and the gentle rustling of the wind in the oaks. It all felt like coming home. The Dawsons insisted on hosting a gathering to celebrate John's freedom and Blaze's heroism. The entire town was invited, and by evening, the ranch buzzed with life. Tables laden with food were set up under strings of lights, and children ran around, laughing and playing. Blaze was the star of the night, his presence commanding respect and admiration. Townsfolk lined up to see the horse, some bringing small gifts or treats as tokens of appreciation. John watched from a distance, a faint smile on his face. "You know," Sheriff Ward said, approaching John with a cup of coffee in hand, "that horse of yours did more for this town than most people ever will." John chuckled softly. "Blaze isn't just a horse, Sheriff. He's family." Ward nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're lucky to have him, and I'm lucky this town has folks like you." As the celebration wound down, Margaret stood to address the crowd. "Tonight, we're not just celebrating Emily's return and John's freedom," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "We're celebrating the loyalty and courage that brought us together. Blaze reminded us what it means to trust, to hope, and to never give up. And John reminded us of the strength it takes to stand tall, even when the world turns against you." The crowd erupted into applause, and Margaret turned to John with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." John nodded, his heart full. "It wasn't just me," he said, looking at Blaze. "It was all of us." The night ended with the family sitting on the porch, the quiet hum of crickets filling the air. Emily leaned against John, clutching her teddy bear, while Blaze grazed nearby. "Do you think Blaze knows he's a hero?" Emily asked, her voice soft. John smiled, looking at the horse. "I think he knows he's loved," he said, "and that's all that matters." As the stars lit up the Texas sky, the Dawson Ranch stood as a beacon of resilience and hope. For John, Blaze, and the Dawsons, the future was finally bright, a testament to the power of loyalty, love, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his horse. The morning after the celebration, the Dawson Ranch stirred to life under a sky painted with the soft hues of dawn. The crisp air carried a sense of renewal, and for John, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. Standing by the paddock, he watched Blaze grazing peacefully, the stallion's calm demeanor a stark contrast to the turmoil they had endured. William approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. "You sure you want to stick around, John?" he asked, his tone less of a question and more of a reassurance. "You've got every right to move on if that's what you need." John turned to him, his face thoughtful. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "But this ranch, it's the closest thing I've got to a home. Blaze loves it here, and so do I. Besides, there's work to be done." William nodded, a rare smile crossing his weathered face. "Glad to hear it. We could use a steady hand like yours." As the days turned into weeks, life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. John threw himself into the work, repairing fences, tending to the horses, and ensuring the land thrived. Blaze, ever the loyal companion, remained by his side, a silent testament to their shared resilience. Emily, too, began to heal. She spent her days helping Margaret in the garden or reading books under the shade of the old oak tree. But her favorite moments were those she spent with Blaze, who had become her protector and confidant. "Do you think Blaze dreams?" Emily asked one afternoon, brushing the stallion's mane. John chuckled, leaning against the paddock fence. "If he does, I bet he dreams about running free in the open fields." Emily smiled, her hazel eyes twinkling. "I think he dreams about being a hero." John's heart swelled at her words. "He already is, kiddo." The ranch's story had spread far and wide, drawing visitors from neighboring towns and beyond. People came not just to see Blaze, but to hear about the bond between the horse and the man who had been wrongfully accused. Local reporters wrote articles, and even a documentary crew expressed interest in capturing their story. Margaret, ever the pragmatist, saw an opportunity to turn the attention into something meaningful. "We could start a program," she suggested during a family dinner. "Something to teach kids about trust, loyalty, and taking care of animals." Blaze could be the centerpiece. William, who rarely ventured into sentimental territory, nodded thoughtfully. "It's a good idea. This ranch has always been about more than just us." It's about the community. John looked at them, a sense of purpose igniting within him. I like it. Blaze has already taught me more about loyalty than I ever thought possible. Maybe he can teach others, too. The program, aptly named Blaze's Legacy, launched that summer. Children from all walks of life visited the ranch, learning how to care for horses, understand their behavior, and develop trust. Blaze, with his calm demeanor and unshakable loyalty, became a symbol of resilience and hope for the kids who met him. Emily played a central role in the program, sharing her story with a courage that inspired everyone. Blaze saved me, she would tell the kids, her voice steady despite the lingering shadows of her ordeal. He taught me to never give up, no matter how scared you are. For John, the program became more than just a way to give back. It was a path to redemption. Watching the children bond with Blaze, seeing their confidence grow, reminded him that even in the darkest moments, there was always light to be found. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John stood in the paddock with Blaze, the golden light casting long shadows across the field. "We've come a long way, boy," he said, his voice tinged with gratitude. "I don't know where I'd be without you." Blaze nickered softly, nudging John's shoulder as if to say, "I'll always be here." The Dawson Ranch, once a quiet corner of the Texas plains, had become a beacon of hope and resilience. For Margaret and William, it was a place of healing and community. For Emily, it was a sanctuary where she could rediscover her joy. And for John, it was proof that even in the face of adversity, loyalty and love could prevail. As the stars lit up the vast Texas sky that night, John sat on the porch with Blaze grazing nearby. Emily curled up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Uncle John," she said softly, "do you think Blaze knows how special he is?" John smiled, his gaze fixed on the stallion. "I think he knows, Emily," he replied, "because we remind him every day." And as the night settled over the ranch, one thing was clear. This wasn't just the end of a journey. It was the start of something extraordinary, where trust, courage, and love would always guide them forward. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and if you've watched until this point, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that's on the end screen for you. It's really exciting.